Hi, it's Tony from Cassette Come Back, and today I'm going to do another video on one of my favourite cassettes. Now, the word favourite implies that it's subjective. I'm not saying these are the best cassettes at the time. I'm not saying they're the best cassettes now. I'm just saying, when I look back, these are cassettes which I remember fondly and still enjoy nowadays. So, what is today's cassette? Well, let's go back to the mid-80s again. Yes, mid-80s. And around that time, chances are, I was buying something like this, the original Maxell UDII. I always thought it was a great looking cassette, and it was a great performing cassette. I really like this cassette. But I was also mixing it in with things like this. The mid-80s, I think this is the 85D, and you know, this was following Sony with the all-clear shell. This was the first D with the all-clear shell, and again, these were super cassettes. I really like them. But neither of these are the subject of today's video, because when I had a little bit more money, I'd sometimes treat myself to something which I thought was a bit better. And in those days, one that jumps out at me, which I remember buying quite a few of and really enjoying, was this. The Maxell UDII. Now, this is a Type 2 high position cassette. I mean, if you look at it compared to the UR, yes, they have a striking similarity, but the UDII with the gold writing on it and the big shiny reflective gold sticker on it, it just looked better. And it's like that old saying that chefs use: the first bite is with the eye. And sometimes, you know, even when they're not actually doing anything with music, some cassettes just sound good just by looking at them. I know that sounds stupid, but it's true. And this, when I first saw these, it's like, oh, I like these are familiar, these I know. But this one, this looks premium. This is gold. This is gonna sound better. And indeed, it is a very attractive cassette. Now, I'm not quite sure where the UDII came in Maxell's range. Well, I know where it came in, but I don't know what the purpose of creating it was. But that didn't stop it being a really good cassette, and it's one that I could use in my low-end stuff, and it still sounded really good. Whereas, you know, the XLII of the same age didn't sound as good to my ears. I preferred these UDII to the XLII. And even nowadays, these UDII sound really good. But I've got a theory as to why they sounded good compared to the XLII in my low-end gear, and why nowadays they're a bit rarer. But yeah, just indulge me. I'm going to go over to my Aiwa deck with the inbuilt test tones and the VU meter so we can look at the biasing and you can see what my theory is. So, where does the UD range come in? What was the point of them? I mean, if you look at Maxell's range in 85, the top end you had the XL2S and the XL2 for Type 2, and then you had the XL1S and the XL1 for Type 1. So where does the UD1 and the UD2 fit in? Well, I've got a theory. It's not quite perfect. It's not going to play out exactly right here, but maybe you can see where I'm coming from. If you think back in them days, the biggest selling tapes were really TDK. I mean, the SA is well known to be the biggest selling tape ever. And certainly, most Japanese decks would have been calibrated to the SA. Now, let me show you what I mean. Let's take a 1985 XL2, okay, and see what the biasing and levels like. Now, this deck is an Aiwa, and I've had this calibrated to Sony UX, because Aiwa, Sony, etc., and I like the UX a lot. So if we look now at the levels being right for bias and level, we can see on the XL2 that the bias is a bit low, so it needs negative bias to try and bring it up to the level. Okay, so negative bias, it needs a bit of level taken down, but if you look at it, we're about there, and we've got the bias in negative, it's at around 9:30 there, and the levels got to be reduced a bit to 11 o'clock. So, but we're about there on the XL2. Now, if we take an SA from 1985, which, like I say, a lot of decks were calibrated to, let's see how that compares with the levels we're seeing on the XL2. Now, if we look now at the SA, we can see that the SA is massively over-biased compared to an XL2. So we need to turn that right down. In fact, give that some positive bias. A little bit less level. And there we can see the SA, because the bias now is at around about 1:30. So there's positive bias added here. So as we can see, between it being 1:30 on the SA and at about 9:30 on the XL2, we can see bias-wise, there's a big difference. So if you put an XL2 in a deck that was calibrated for an SA, you're going to find it sounds dull. I'm not saying the XL2 isn't a great cassette, it is, but I'm just saying, if you had a deck that you couldn't calibrate the bias on, like most boom boxes, most hi-fis, you're going to find that it sounds a little dull. So if we take the the UD2 now, let's see how that compares with an SA, and if indeed it is the same formulation as the XL2. And if we look, it isn't. But if we look at how much negative we need to give this, the level's about the same as an SA, and the negative bias here is at 11 as opposed to 9:30 on the XL2. So what I'm saying is maybe, just maybe, the UD series, apart from being, the entry level, maybe the UD series was all about trying to get a tape that was more compatible and would sound good in a deck that was designed and calibrated, well, not designed, but calibrated to the SA, if you will. The XL2, if you had a deck with calibration facilities, you can calibrate it in an XL2 is superb. That was Maxell's special formula. However, they made the UD2 to be more compatible with decks that were internally calibrated for the SA. It's just a theory, but it doesn't matter, because now I'm going to switch over to another deck and we're going to do some recording on it. And this other deck, it's a Jewelwell, but don't be scared. Okay, so here is the only Jewelwell deck that I own. And why is that? Well, Jewelwell decks, let's be honest, were sold because when you had them mostly, they were at the lower end of the scale, and people thought, hey, I'm getting 2 cassette decks for the price of one, what a bargain. So they bought them, but unfortunately, even though there are quite a lot of good Jewelwell decks, they're not for me. When I'm recording, I like to have 3 heads so I can monitor, make sure that if I'm using used cassettes that I've got no damage or dropouts, and also I can bias them up properly. And this Aiwa ADWX909 is kind of unique insofar as it is the only 3-head Jewelwell deck ever made, and it does have bias adjustment. So I really like it for that. And the thing is, a lot of dual head decks were basically, there was one motor, one set of belts, and it would power both decks, cost saving exercise. That's what Jewelwell decks were mostly for, cost saving, and of course high speed dubbing if you wanted to do that, if you really wanted to make a bad quality recording. But anyway, so this one, however, is basically 2 decks in one. The left hand deck, which is auto reverse, has a separate output at the back than the right hand deck, which is a 3-head record deck. Also, this has a separate motor, and it also has separate audio circuitry, because to adjust the internal calibration and levels and stuff on this, it's on different boards than it is on this one. This has different audio boards. It's basically like 2 separate decks in one. This has its own motors, this has its own internal pots. So yeah, it's like a 3-head deck and a playback deck in one. And the other thing I love about it is this deck could have only come from the 80s. Look at it. I mean, this is, you want to say, what decade did this come from? No one's going to say anything but the 80s. The red writing and the VU meters here and double LCDs, not LCDs, LEDs. And yeah, it just screams 80s. So I love how this looks. but it's also a very, very competent performer. And like I say, I think Aiwa decks are very underrated. So we're going to use the UDS-II in here. I've already biased it up for it. I mean, this deck doesn't have any inbuilt test tones. It's just got a bias fine, and that's it. But doesn't matter. It still sounds great. So I'm going to now play a bit of music I made a long time ago when I was feeling a bit bored and decided to do a bit of EDM. So it's got plenty of hi-hats in there, which I like. It's got mids, but it's got good bass as well. So you'll be able to see what sort of things this cassette can do. So this is City Lights, and let's get it recording. I got to say the VU meters on this deck are a bit poor though. They're not very sensitive. Here's the source. And now back to the tape. Takes the bass well, it really does handle the bass well. Now we've got a lot of treble. Go back to the source. Back to the tape. Quiet bit. Now I'm noticing it's not the tape, but the source sounds louder simply because I don't think the levels are quite calibrated right, but you can't calibrate the levels on the desk, only the bias. Still sounds good though. Back to the source. You can see the source is peaking constantly sort of at +5, but the tape peaks at 3. So what do you make of that? I mean, for a humble tape that really didn't cost much more than an equivalent Type 1 at the time, I think this does a very admirable job. And yeah, this is a pretty good little deck as well for recording in. So if you see one knocking round, have a look. It might be something that's, you know, just purely to the aesthetics and the fact that it's the only 3-head Jewelwell deck going. It's just a nice little thing to have, and they're really not that expensive when you can find them. Well, when you can find them when they're not on eBay, they're not that expensive. So there we go. I mean, I forgot to mention these in America for some reason were called UDS-IIs, but for the entry-level Type 2 from the mid-80s from Maxell, I think this is a superb cassette. I really do. And I mean, at the time, I didn't feel the need to try anything else, because these, like I say, these were cheaper than the XL2s. They were cheaper than SAs as well. Because if you think, at that time, mid-80s, the Type 2 range for TDK sort of started with the SA, and then they had the SAX. Sony had the UX, and then the UXS, etc. But they didn't have anything below that. And this came in at a lower price than the SA, or the UX, or the XL2. And yet, to my ears, not as good a cassette, but, well, it sounds as good as a cassette. I mean, graphs and oscilloscopes might say otherwise, but to somebody in the mid-80s who had low-end gear, I couldn't really substantiate why I would pay more for an XL2 or an SA over the UDI-II, which were available in multi-packs and were usually cheaper. So yeah, like I say, favourite is subjective, but the UDI-II is a cassette that holds a special place in my heart, because they were great then, they still look good now, they still sound good now, and I really like them. Okay, thanks for that. As always, look out for the next video, please subscribe and like, and until then, take care. Bye bye.